Hey, thanks for joining today. I'm here together with Jodie, and we're going to talk about an interesting topic, something we haven't talked about at all on PHP Annotated, Jodie. And I invited you specifically because, well, you're a colleague of mine. You're a developer advocate at JetBrains, and you're, doing a lot of things with AI, right? So before we dive into all the questions we might have and things to talk about, I wanted to check up. Do you want to quickly introduce yourself? Because I reckon my audience is within the PHP world. You're mostly in the Python world, I think.
Yes.
And
yeah.
AI in general. So who are you and what brings you here today?
Yeah. So as Brent said, I'm Jodie. I've been working at JetBrains as a developer advocate for about 2.5 years now. But prior to that, my career was purely in data science. I've been a data scientist for almost 10 years now. And prior to that, my background was academic, not so unusual for a data scientist. So my PhD was in psychology and I fell in love with statistics. So my postdoc was in biostats, then found my way into the world of data science. So a big chunk of my career in data science has been in an area called natural language processing. This is the field that large language models came from. And so, when large language models came out, I obviously have been following along with that with a lot of interest, and I have a lot of opinions. So we can talk about those today.
Nice. Should I say Dr. Jodie?
No, do not. I'm Australian. I'm allergic to people calling me that.
Okay. Well, I did see you being introduced in some talks as Dr. Jodie.
Look, it helps with the credibility, but it is awkward to be talked about like that. So
I can call you Jodie.
You could just call me Jodie. That's fine.
Nice. AI, natural language processing, super interesting. And I have to admit, Jodie, I'm still looking for my own opinion on the matter. I use AI while coding. I use it a little bit.
Yeah.
There are definitely cases where I find it very interesting and helpful, but there's also a lot of cases where I'm like, it's not necessarily unhelpful, but it's also not saving me huge amounts of time. The impression I get from many people when they say, oh yeah, I use AI all the time and it's super helpful, I'm still struggling with that. And I don't know if that's just me not understanding how I should use the tools or whether there is there's actually something to say there. What's your opinion about AI for code and the things we do with it as programmers?
Yeah, so I guess the evidence that seems to be coming out now is that AI, so let's kind of actually define terminology a little bit to be a bit more precise. So AI has always been a pretty amorphous term. It is a formal field. It's been a field for around 70 years now, but it's always been this kind of blanket term to mean anything that a machine or a system can automate that would be done by human cognition. So those kind of rule-based chatbots like Eliza, I don't know if you ever heard of that. It's like a psychotherapy chatbot from the 60s. Yeah. This would be AI, but by today's standards, it's extremely primitive. So when we talk about AI now, we're mostly talking about generative models, and we're mostly talking about generative models that can do three things. They can generate text, they can generate images, or they can generate speech or music. So these are kind of the models we're talking about. And these are a tiny, tiny subset of the whole field of machine learning and AI generally, which is even broader than machine learning. So when we talk about AI for coding, we're specifically talking about large language models. And we can kind of get into, at a high level, how these work. So people have been researching use cases for these generative models. And honestly, it has been a little bit of a struggle to find a good market fit for these models for a few reasons. One is something that I think you've come up against, which is these models have severe limitations about how they can actually reason. So they're really not good at doing complex reasoning. They're not good at decomposing complex problems into the steps that you would need to do. And they're also not good at being able to kind of chain together by themselves more difficult tasks. So I sort of suspect what you've been trying to use it for, because you're an extremely experienced developer, is more complex tasks. And it just falls to pieces when it has to do that. What people are finding that it's good for is more tedious tasks. So say you don't want to write a bunch of unit tests, or you want a scaffold to write unit tests. It's really good at doing that. Something I use it for a lot is in Python, we have a lot of packages for doing graphing. I would say the API of most of them is not particularly nice. And so I use it a lot because I can't remember off the top of my head how to use the packages. It's fantastic at generating this sort of boilerplate. So I think it definitely has a use case. I think it's good for speeding up stuff that maybe you can't remember how to do because you don't do it that often. It's good for maybe explaining how a piece of code works. I use it for that a lot because I'm not that good at reading code. I'm a data scientist. We don't write or read the best code. But I think it really falls down when you start talking about like building applications, doing complex logic within coding. And this is definitely like a consistent story we're seeing over and over again.
Okay, so it's not necessarily me.
No, but it's just you're too good. This is the problem.
I might have wrong expectations then, because I have to admit, like, I think it was the previous version of PHP Storm that introduced the full line code completion, which is a local AI model, and it gives very short suggestions. And those are actually, I find I use them quite often now. But the thing is, I don't notice I use them because I'm so used to autocompletion in PHP Storm already. But it's just able to autocomplete a little bit more with a little bit more context. And that's useful. But whenever I try to tackle a larger problem, or when I'm really struggling to solve an algorithmic problem or anything, I try using AI, and it always ends up with I read something that doesn't work, or it actually never works for the things I want to do. It's like it works 90% of what it should do, and then I still have to read through it and figure it out. And you said you're not that much of an experienced programmer, but let me tell you, something programmers really don't like to do is reading other people's code. I even don't like reading my own code, actually. So it's difficult if you have like 10, 20 lines of lines of generated code. Yeah. I don't really feel motivated reading through all of that, but I have to admit that a lot of people in the PHP community, they actually seem to like it a lot. So I don't know how they are doing it. I actually want to remind people that if you have like thoughts during this conversation, leave them in the comments down below, and we'll go through them as well. And I'll answer you in the comments, or I might make like a follow-up video about this. I'm really interested to learn more about how other people are doing it. Yeah. Okay. So the full line code completion is like the small bits. They are pretty helpful because they boilerplate, boring code. So I might need to just readjust my expectations there a little bit.
Yeah. Because I think the problem you have is, especially because the way the models have been packaged, right? They're basically trained to act like chatbots. They're trained on a whole bunch of conversations. So it feels very human. And the problem is it's easy to get fooled that you are actually speaking to another person. And then the expectation comes, okay, I think this way. I project my kind of experience onto this model. The model isn't a person. The model can't actually code. The model can generate code. It can autocomplete essentially from sophisticated predictions based on internal models it has from a lot of code that it's seen. It can translate requests from natural language like English or Dutch or whatever into code, but it cannot code. and it cannot reason. So this is the problem, right? It feels like you're speaking to another developer,
right?
But you're not. You are, importing.
I can see. Yeah. I can see how you coming from a psychology background, that this is super interesting as well, because exactly it sounds like a human being.
Yes.
It definitely isn't, but like subconsciously we somehow identify with it. It feels very close. I have a lot of non-technical family and friends who use AI as like a chatbot to ask whatever kind of questions that come to mind. They are mind blown by it.
Maybe I'll give like a brief kind of history of where these models came from. So basically, back when I was at my first job where I did a lot of natural language processing, I was working at a job board. And basically what we were trying to do was use natural language processing to improve the search on the website, because it's text problems, right? And I started at that job in 2017. The first large language model, so the paper about large language models was published in 2017. The first publicly available model, which was released by Google, came out in 2018. And it sort of became consumable through packages in Python, probably like 2019, 2020. So basically, I remember the early large language models. They were, you can still actually play with them, like GPT-1. They're really funny. Like the stuff that they autocomplete is hysterical. I've been giving conference talks about this for a couple of years. I have this example, actually. I'm sorry about this because you're Belgian. It's complete this sentence, Belgium is. It's because I gave this conference the first time at Techorama in Belgium. So
okay.
And GPT-1 says something like, Belgium is a small place, no bigger than a village. Like, you can sort of see, it's just like it's encoded some grammar. It's sort of auto-completing, but it's absolute nonsense.
Right, yeah.
So what has sort of happened over time is the sort of models that large language models are based on are really, really good at scaling. So they're really good at being able to efficiently train over enormous amounts of data. So what this means is you can make the models really, really big. And what they have is a lot of internal connections called parameters. And these parameters allow them to learn the relationships between parts of the input. These are individual tokens. These are basically, you can think of them as words, but it's a little bit more complex than that. So if you think about the relationship between words in a sentence, there's a lot of nuances there. Like a really simple example is something like disambiguation. The word bank in English has several meanings.
Yeah.
And what that meaning is completely dependent of the context. So the models need to learn things like that. They need to learn like negation, like I liked this, but I didn't like this. They need to understand that. They need to understand things like even sarcasm or humor, things like that. These sort of more subtle things are still a bit difficult for these models. So basically, when we get to the point of, say, GPT-3, this was precursor to GPT 3.5, which was the first model under ChatGPT. The models finally got big enough. They had enough input data and they had enough parameters to really start not just learning these grammatical relationships, but start encoding knowledge. And this is called parametric knowledge, the knowledge that's contained within these models, because it just sees text enough times that it encodes this sort of this knowledge.
Yeah.
But the thing is, there's limits to what they learn because they're learning the stuff they're exposed to most frequently.
Yeah.
So they don't learn things that they don't have much training data for. And then because they're just trained to predict the next word in a sentence, they'll do that. Like this is explicitly what they're trained to do. And the chatbot models are even worse because they're further trained to answer questions in like they basically input like a question and then they're trained to, answer a particular answer.
Yeah.
So what happens then is in the absence of parametric knowledge, they will just keep going and predicting something, but it will be false. And this is what we call hallucinations.
Right.
So you have this illusion that the model knows things, and it certainly does have some knowledge of things that are very common. It also has knowledge of things that were incorrect. Like it can be trained, or a lot of the models were trained on, say, blogs that contain conspiracy theories or biases and things like that, because it's also seen that in the training data.
Right.
And it has absolute massive gaps in its knowledge because it just didn't have enough training data about that thing. So this is sort of why these models behave the way they do. They've really just designed to process language. That was all they were designed to do. And this is why this generative market is struggling to find its niche. Because firstly, it was never really what the models were designed for. Well, debatable, but it wasn't the primary purpose of the model.
Right.
But secondly, the hallucination problem is huge and kind of seems very difficult to solve at this point in time.
And it's interesting. A question that's popping up in my head while you're talking about all of this is, so we're using models that weren't, from a coding perspective, right? That weren't really, I mean, code is also text, so it makes sense that it works to a certain level, but they weren't really optimized for code, I reckon. They're just text processing, or yeah.
Yeah, and there's sort of some kind of caveats or subtleties around that. So firstly, some models were further trained. It's a process called fine-tuning to actually generate code. So the first Copilot was a fine-tuning of GPT-3 on code. Yeah. The current Copilot is more up to date than that. And then more kind of recent models, so say the Minstrel models, these are some of the most famous open source models at the moment. They specifically upped the amount of code in their training base.
Yeah.
But again, it's not like what's called symbolic logic. This is sort of where you have rules, like arithmetic is symbolic logic, right? This is more kind of what we would traditionally think of as coding. Like all of the stuff that you learn in a computer sciences degree, this is exactly what these models are not taught. They're taught how to describe in language, in a programming language, how to solve a certain problem. And they do based on examples they've seen before.
Okay, you mentioned a couple of problems as well, like the hallucinations you talked about. I notice when I try to use AI completions for code specifically, it's rarely 100% correct. So there is still a lot of room for improvement. But at the same time, I'm hearing these big quotes that for the next like big leap in AI development, we're gonna need a lot more than what, like energy consumption, for example. We need some solutions there as well. Like, are we nearing the limits of what we can do today with these models? What's the future there?
Yeah, so I'm hearing the stuff about energy consumption as well, water as well, because you need to be able to cool down the server farms. I'm also aware that a lot of the focus seems to be on scaling. So the kind of conventional wisdom at the moment is the more data you input into these models and the more parameters, the more they can do. And it sort of makes sense based on what I've explained, right? Like the more data it's exposed to and the more parameters it has to learn, the more it can learn. So this seems to be a path that, at least up until 3 months ago when I was reading about this, was what was being aggressively followed. I'm seeing quotes that potentially the next generation of models may cost in the several billions to train, like 10 billion. Now, what we're facing is some hard limits. We're facing electricity limits. We're facing like financial limits, because you need to make money back on this.
Right. Yeah.
So these are sort of problems. They're also more subtle problems. So what I've heard is that we're literally running out of data for people to actually train these models on.
Interesting.
And there seems to be an additional problem where so much AI-generated text is being produced now This is polluting the training pools. So this also seems to be a hard limit.
Right.
But there's an additional problem which is beyond the training, and that actually comes with running these models. So running predictions through these models is called inference. And it's actually a bit more complex than it is for a normal machine learning model, because what you need to do is you have a prompt. So let's say I write a prompt to a GPT model. I say, please write me a poem about cats. I don't know, something like that. So what it'll do is it'll take my prompt, it'll input that into the model once, it'll spit out one word, it'll append that word to my prompt, pass the whole thing in again, and basically round and round and round until it hits what's called a stop token. And this will tell the model, stop predicting, and then it'll send back my prediction. Now, the problem is even doing one round of prediction on these models as they grow becomes really slow.
Right.
Yes. If you're not using a really powerful machine with a lot of GPUs.
Yeah.
And these are expensive to run. So it's not just power limits to train the models, it's running them. And this is why people are sort of, I don't know if you've heard rumors, people saying that the hype bubble's about to burst.
Yeah.
Because in order to actually capitalize on this technology, you need to have a use case that is so helpful that it will pay for not only the initial training costs, but the ongoing inference costs. So my suspicion is we're actually hitting a limit with how big the models can get.
Okay.
However, people are doing clever things with messing around with how the models do predictions, which allows them to get more power or more predictive ability out of smaller models. And this year we've actually seen a swing back where people are saying, like, how small can we make these models and still get similar performance?
Okay. Yeah. Well, yeah, that's that's of course the classic programmer way to do it. We run into limits and then we just try to squeeze out a little bit more or a lot more, wherever possible. And that's pretty cool. However, it also makes sense that if I understand you correctly, like the more complex these models grow, of course, they will need to require more time to make the right predictions. And so even if you had all the power in the world to train the models, they would grow so large that it wouldn't be useful to use on your own computers with the hardware we have.
Yeah, exactly. And what we've seen sort of end of last year, beginning of this year, is sort of reworking of larger models. So they will actually run pretty efficiently on your own computer. Like Olama, you might have seen this project floating around. These sort of models really have that focus.
Gotcha. Yeah. So you mentioned the hype bubble as well. Like you said it pretty clearly, actually. Like I wouldn't have dared to phrase it like this in a question, but since you mentioned it, something about to burst. This is like, how serious are we talking here? This, I mean, lots of businesses are embracing AI. I've seen more and more messages on social media and in the news as well that, we're running into these limits. What's next? Yeah, what are your thoughts about the hype bubble?
Yeah, so a very interesting thing that has been happening in the last months is a number of people have been releasing estimates about the deficit in terms of the gap between investment and revenue in terms of AI companies. And I think it was Goldman Sachs released a pretty, let's say, strong report talking about how this is in the hundreds of billions at this point. Yeah. So I think what happened was people saw this technology. It is compelling when you see it. Like you said, you have friends and relatives who are not in tech. They use it, and for them, it just feels so powerful. But as you've seen yourself, it has specific use cases. I strongly believe in the use case of helping programming. We'll come back to that later, but I'll sort of talk about why I think the bubble has been overextended. So initially, when people saw, I think, the potential of the GPT models, and like I said, I think this was at the point of GPT-3, maybe even GPT-2, was people like, okay, as we scale these models, this is really something promising. This is something we hadn't seen before with natural language processing.
Right. Yeah.
I think they got a bit carried away, and there's been a little bit of an arms race between major tech companies to build the biggest models. I put together a timeline for one of my talks where I kind of showed not all of them, just the major models that have been released in the last 2 years.
Yeah.
And it's crazy. There are so many of them. So the problem is there are specific use cases for these models because you need to check the outputs. You can't just get these models to completely automate processes like writing or generating code or creating fiction or creating copy. Like, you cannot, because firstly, they all tend to write with this tone that I think everyone recognizes now, the ChatGPT tone. And so I think the content is actually having a bit of an uncanny valley feel, and it's not resonating as much as I think we thought it would. But secondly, they hallucinate. It's the major problem. And you need someone to fact check it and check that it's okay. Yeah. There was a really interesting case that came up beginning of this year. Air Canada had basically automated their customer chat, to have a LLM running behind it.
Right.
And what ended up happening was the LLM made up a policy that told a customer, you can basically, I think he needed to cancel his flight or something, or change his flight. And they said, no problem, you can get full reimbursement for this. It was something like over 1,000 Canadian dollars. So he canceled his flight or changed his flight, something like that, went to go and get the reimbursement. And the actual customer service person said, no, that's against our policy. And so then a lawsuit ensued. And it sort of brought up the question, who is responsible for what the LLM says if it hallucinates? Now, of course, in my mind, it's Air Canada.
Yeah.
But this is obviously going to become a legal gray area. There was a case actually of a lawyer, I think, who got disbarred because they used an LLM to put together a brief, and the LLM completely hallucinated cases. So you can see there are really serious implications for trying to automate things with these models. And I don't think that the market fit is quite there yet. The technology is not mature enough, I think, would be the most generous interpretation. It may never get to the point where hallucinations are not a problem. So this is the problem we're running into.
You mentioned, by the way, like the ChatGPT tone that people recognize now. Yeah. I actually, just as a total side note here, but I started writing a fantasy novel last year, and I had this idea to use ChatGPT to help me copy edit, and it wasn't. This is a year ago, so maybe it's better now. But like exactly the first of all, it didn't have know all the context, and I thought I was smart enough first trying to explain to ChatGPT what it should do, but still there were so many errors. So outside of coding, I also experienced that firsthand. What I did really like though, writing that fantasy novel, it's still a work in progress, but I used Midjourney to just paste in some of my paragraphs and then generate images from it. And that was pretty cool because suddenly I'm not a graphic person, so I cannot draw myself, but suddenly I had visual images, like visualizing the things, the story I was telling in my mind. And that was pretty cool because it really helped me further immerse into my writing. So that's just purely anecdotal and but still there are some cases where I found AI to be Midjourney stuff to be really helpful and actually do something that nothing else can do. Basically, that was pretty cool. Yeah.
I actually wanted to bring up a really interesting study that I read about that came out last month. which was about creativity with LLMs. So I really like this idea of LLMs, generative image models, these sort of things, being a catalyst for creativity. I was actually in a live stream yesterday with the writer team talking about AI in games. And someone brought up in the comments that in order to do sort of design of, say, like background characters and things like that, they actually like using these generative models as a basis because it's kind of a tedious task, right? And then they can use that as the basis and just modify it to their own, game aesthetic.
Right.
But in terms of like whether these models are actually creative in and of themselves, I really like this study. It was really cute. So basically what they did was they got two groups of people and they asked them to generate a bunch of creative writing prompts. And one group was allowed to use an LLM and the other one was not. So what they then did is they compared how creative each of the groups were by seeing both the number and variety of ideas. And what they found was the group that was allowed to use the LLM at an individual level, they were more creative.
Right.
But when you compared as a group, yeah, because all the ideas kept overlapping. The LLM just kept converging on the same ideas over and over again because it's an averaging of its training data. So basically the group that were allowed to use the LLM as a collective came up with far fewer ideas. So it's really interesting because I think you can feel more creative when you're using it, but you've got to be careful because if you don't inject enough of your own human spark, let's call it that, into it, you're really just going to be rehashing the same ideas that came from the training data. It's going to be derivative because how can it be anything other than that?
Yeah. I like for my writing, I completely abandoned the ChatGPT thing because because of that. It didn't feel my own anymore.
It felt like a cliche, maybe even.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but also the phrasing for like, I like how you said it. It feels very AI generated. That's interesting because I remember a year ago we were talking about how to detect AI generated content, and I feel like I just on site I can already tell most of the time that this was written by AI and this is like genuine. It's interesting how we trained ourselves basically.
Exactly.
You mentioned fake data as well, like AI generated data that's coming in and feeding existing models now. That seems to be I'm a bit into content creation. You might know that YouTube here, a blog as well. I've always tried to avoid writing for the sake of the numbers. So, but it's something I've seen in the blogging world a lot these days, AI generated content. And my general feeling about it is that I feel sad actually about it, that we're just dumping more of the same into the internet. It's already a pretty screwed up place maybe, but full of crap, but there are very good parts of it. And it feels like we're now we're feeding the tools with more of the same stuff. And I feel really sad about it because like the genuine, the super interesting, the human things that used to be written, I see less and less often. And that really makes me sad actually.
Yeah, and it actually, there are studies coming out that this impacts the performance of these models. And so it totally makes sense if you think about it. So I'll try and explain like the intuition behind it in a non-technical way. Okay, so in order for models to make good predictions, like any models, they need to have like a variance in the target, right? Like the thing they're trying to predict. So let's say if you have, I don't know, house prices that you're trying to predict, you need to have a range of house prices. Otherwise, the fact that a house is in California versus New York, or wait, maybe they're both expensive, but I'm not American. I don't know. California versus not California. it's not going to mean anything because all the houses cost the same.
Right.
So anything that you input into the model doesn't mean anything. So because these models, like there's a guy called Andre Karpathy, he's very well known in this area. He actually has an excellent video called A Busy Person's Guide to LLMs. If you want like a much better introduction than I could ever give to this area, I'd fully recommend it for anyone who wants it. Like very, very approachable, but goes into some depth. It's very, very good. So Andre Karpathy in this video, he describes what LLMs do as a lossy compression of their training data. So obviously what you're doing is averaging everything. So you get the most common signal.
Right.
So then if you train on that again, you've lost even more variance because what you're doing is you're basically converging everything on this kind of much less diverse data set. And it means that the things that the model can learn are greatly reduced because it can only learn how to predict word order in the way that an LLM would write it. It can only write about the sort of topics that LLMs have commonly seen. So this is why I said it's a major, major problem because the models themselves will get less good when they're faced with stuff that a human is writing as a prompt input because it won't have really seen organically generated text as often as it's seen the crap that it generates itself.
Right. Yeah, it's super interesting. It reminds me of, there was this popular YouTube video where someone made a video, uploaded it to YouTube, downloaded it again, uploaded it again, did so 100 times. And just like that feedback loop, right? And it got worse and worse over time. And it's not the same as this, but in a way, like feeding data to yourself, it always will, average out, right? And won't result in great results. Maybe I'm naive here, but I'm also thinking maybe it's a self-correcting system because if we reach a point where there's too much crap we cannot train new models anymore that are useful, so we will be forced back to, maybe I'm too naive here, but we will be forced to making more content ourselves again, which could feed a new generation of better models. But yeah, maybe that's a bit naive of me.
Well, I strongly suspect. So one of the reasons I actually started giving talks trying to cut through AI hype is I'm not a very artistic person myself, but I would like to be. Like, it's just I don't have the talent, right? And I have a huge amount of respect for artists of all types. So writers, designers, painters, and basically the tone of the conversations at the beginning of last year, especially after GPT-4 came out, that was March last year, they were quite disrespectful about these sort of professions, saying like basically, oh, designers and copy editors and all these people, they're going to be gone soon. Like,
right, yeah.
And the truth of the matter is there isn't a craft to writing well. And I think after, let's say, over a year of living with these models being mainstream, I don't think we're in any danger of these jobs being truly replaced. If you truly have a craft of writing mastered, I don't think you can be replaced that easily.
Right. Yeah, that's. I remember like the big fear a year ago, like we're all gonna get replaced. And if we're seeing what AI can generate today, I don't think there's. I agree with you. There's no fear of that happening anytime soon.
Yes.
No, but I do wonder, like, what's your vision for AI in the future? Where are we going with this? Because it feels like we're still a bit unsure about what's gonna happen. But if you could just say like your gut feeling, right? Shouldn't be backed by anything besides just maybe your hopes and your dreams. What do you want to see in the future?
Yeah, so it's interesting actually. Like I get asked this question a lot, especially because I give talks about artificial general intelligence and things like that.
Yeah.
Where do you see this stuff in 5 years? I think the answer I always give to that, and I'll kind of get onto my hopes and dreams, because no one's ever actually asked me that. But in terms of like what I see actually happening even in the next year, I don't know, because to be honest, if you had asked me in 2017, do you think we would have models like this in 5 years? I would have been like, no. Like it felt impossible back then.
Right.
Now, what I would kind of hope for these models is I would hope they sort of, the use cases will sort of pan out where they are actually useful. So these are natural language models. What they were designed for was to solve natural language problems. And the reason the generative models have become the big ones is because it's really easy to scale the training data.
Right.
But really, the things that they're good at are the things that are natural language problems that they were always designed to solve. So what I'm hoping is maybe we'll see them more in, I don't know, aiding things like interactive education. Like, let's say you have a use case where a publisher wants to generate more kind of interactive ways for people to learn. So it could be that you as a course creator use the LLM to say, I have this book chapter. I want you to identify which paragraphs are about this topic. This is a problem in NLP called topic classification or text classification. And then what I want you to do is take all those paragraphs and generate questions about them.
Yeah.
These would need to be manually checked, but this could potentially, I don't know, kick off much more interesting content. Maybe this is being done already. I haven't looked into it, but I think this is such a nice use case.
Right.
I would like to see, just more interesting stuff being done in the fields of text processing and NLP problems, improvements to search that are not like what Google tried. I don't understand how they screwed that up so bad. But I would just like to see people leaning into the strengths of the model and getting rid of a lot of these use cases that just assume the models don't hallucinate, because these are frankly dangerous and irresponsible.
Yeah, and if we can circle back to code for a minute, like I said at the very start, I've been using full-line code completion more and more. And, I don't even notice it anymore, but it's just there and it's correct 90% of the time. And that's fine, because I'm in charge of choosing whether I want to accept this suggestion or not. And it's small enough to understand the scope and know whether it's good or not without having to stop my flow. So I think it might already be happening where we're just finding the right places to use AI. And I'm still using AI, which is, I know, not exactly the right term here, but it's super interesting to see, like 5 years ago where we were and where we are today, and it's only guessing where we'll be a year or 5 years from now. But
and it's also something that I say a lot about using AI assistants for code. Is, the reason we called it AI Assistant JetBrains was very deliberate, because it's supposed to be a productivity enhancement tool.
Right.
And I think it's a good use case because you have a few checks. So you have the developer obviously is going to check it, but you have a compiler or an interpreter that's going to check it as well. And this makes it pretty low stakes. If basically it makes a mistake, you can be like, okay, that's kind of annoying, but at least it's given me a scaffold for where to look. There does seem to be some, like, there was a Source Labs survey done that said there were people who were, committing that code without checking it. But people will do that. Like, those people will be doing that with Stack Overflow. So it's not it's not like this is the fault of the LLM. This is a cultural problem.
Looking forward to see where this is going. I found myself very skeptical a year ago. I find myself a little less skeptical today, but I'm still looking forward to when it evens out and when we find that balance. And I'm not particularly a person riding the hype, so for me it's fine if it settles down a bit. But yeah, we cannot deny that it is helpful, and it has impacted a lot of people all around the world from different perspectives, programmers as well. So very interesting.
Yeah, and I think the skepticism comes from the fact that a lot of the claims really are super overblown. But once you understand a little bit about the fundamentals of the model, like I've explained some, but again, I would recommend that Andre Karpathy video.
Definitely.
You can have a much more balanced view about it and understand, okay, where is it strong? Where is it weak? It's just a model. So not a person. It's not a super intelligence. It's just a model. So I think this helps with the confusion. And I think this helps not necessarily needing to feel like a skeptic anymore. You can just be like, okay, I understand where I think it'll work based on the evidence.
Yeah.
I will go with those use cases and I won't try to overextend the model.
Cool. Well, Jodie, thank you for your time, and thank you for explaining so many interesting things. We went into this conversation during like the briefing. I said I didn't necessarily wanted to talk about all the technical details. The philosophical side is much more interesting to me, and I feel like we did that. So thank you for that. Thank you for sharing all these interesting thoughts. Really, really cool.
It was my pleasure.
I would love to invite you again a year from now or something, and then we can reflect on what happened the past year, because definitely a lot of things will happen. I don't think we can predict. I don't think we're in such a stable period yet. But that's part of the fun as well, I guess.
Yes. And every time I do one of these sort of interviews, I'm like, let's see how many of my predictions actually pan out.
Yeah.
Like I said, I have a lot of opinions just like everyone else. Don't trust anyone who has strong opinions in this. Go and get like multiple opinions.
Well, that's very good advice. Thank you for being here, Jodie. Thank you for being here and watching. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Leave a like as well. That helps out. And we'll see each other in the next one. Okay. Bye-bye.